Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Walid Faris. I'm going to serve as the chair and the discussant of this great panel. I'd like to first of all thank ASMEA, the leadership, those in charge of organizing this great event, and just to state in the name of my colleagues that ASMEA is just doing better and better every year. This panel is an exceptional one. It is coming in the same year where the Arab Spring is developing. I would like to make a couple quick remarks, and then I will introduce the panel, and then we'll have each speaker speaking for around 15, maybe a few more minutes, and then the best part is going to be the second part where we are going to be engaging in questions and answers. Last year, we had a panel, Dr. Salami was part of it, which dealt with what was projection to the Arab Spring. Last year at ASMEA, I was on this panel, and I held in my hands my own book, which is titled The Coming Revolution. It was the first announcement of the book made at ASMEA. And soon enough, a few months later, it did happen. Part of it, at least, did happen. So now brace yourselves, whatever you're going to hear from this panel, and the projections, we have 4 giants in the field. The projections are going to be very important. Last year, we were looking at the rise of civil societies and their tolerance of authoritarian regimes. And that tolerance reached a point, a critical mass, whereby there were no more tolerance, and the Arab Spring began. We argued that they were predecessors to the Arab Spring. 2 of them occurred in the Middle East. One of them was in 2005, known as the Cedars Revolution, and the other one in 2009 in Tehran, known as the Green Revolution. Those 2 breaking moments in the Middle East sent one important signal to the rest of the region, that large masses of people that are determined and united with little fear from the regime can at least begin to provoke change or express themselves. The third factor that we've discussed was the rise of technology, of internet, Facebook, YouTube, interconnected activities online. Third element were the changes that were taking place in the Middle East after 9/11. So the panel reached a point whereby changes in Afghanistan, changes in Iraq, the rise of multi-party systems, successful or mediocre, that's a different question. The 2 revolts in Lebanon and Iran and internet basically started to help the Arab world to find its own path for the events that are taking place today, this year. The geopolitics of the Arab Spring, if you can call them with this concept, have developed 2 points. One is basically a race between 2 forces following the gradual collapse of the authoritarian regimes. As we saw in Egypt, Mubarak down, in Tunisia, Ben Ali down, in Libya, the Gaddafi story is no more. Yemen and Syria are challenging their own authoritarian regimes. What comes after that, in the second wave, is basically a race, long-range race, between the political forces that came together in the Arab Spring, but once the regimes are down, they are now in a state of competition. Namely, on the one hand, the Islamist forces of all kinds. On the other hand, secular forces, and to the side of secular forces, minorities. This is where this panel is going to be focusing on. The role of these minorities, the impact of the Arab Spring on these minorities across the region. Now, when we introduce the notion of minorities in the Middle East, it's a very large notion that our good 4 experts are going to be engaging in. It's much bigger than the term of minorities, and not all minorities want to call themselves minorities. So I'm proposing what we call a summa divisio, a division of concepts, between what is religious minorities and ethnic minorities. And within the religious minorities, you have those that combine sectarian religious minorities and those that combine ethnic religious minorities. Now, the challenge of the minorities across the region, as we are going to see, is diverse. You have the minorities that are paying the price of the changes that took place in their countries, such as, for example, the Copts of Egypt. And we saw that there were many incidents in Egypt over the past few months following the Arab Spring. Or those who have basically engaged in a change that occurred without a revolt, a regime change, as in Iraq, the Assyrio-Chaldean Christians. But then you have ethnic minorities that are looking at the process, and the panel will discuss one of those cases, the Berbers, more specifically the Kabyles in Algeria. There are those minorities from whom we heard at noon from the Prime Minister of North Iraqi Kurdistan, that are looking at the Arab Spring and hoping that this will bring the change they would like to see so that they could engage in with the other ethnic communities that relates to them. So it is a subject that is vast, that is complex, and that is going to determine, if not at least impact, the future of the Arab Spring. On the panel this afternoon, we have 4 scholars. Dr. Bruce Maddy Weitzman. You have read the bios. I'm not going to repeat the bios. That is something that you have in your hands. All I would like to say are a couple personalized things. Dr. Maddy Weitzman is a scholar who has been lecturing and teaching on both sides of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. So from Tel Aviv to Brandeis to Emory and beyond. His subject is going to be extremely interesting. I dedicated a chapter on the issue of the Berbers, but what we're going to listen to now is basically a specialization on the issue of the Berbers and of the Kabyles. Professor Habib Malik originates from Lebanon. He's Lebanese American. I would like to say a couple personal things about Habib. First, about his father, and that has to be said in this environment. He's the son of the late former president of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Dr. Charles Malik, born in Lebanon, of course, was known worldwide to have been a member of the committee which advanced the draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The legacy of Charles Malik is 20th century, 21st century. And I remember from the old days when, before I immigrate, in the days of Beirut, the speeches of Charles Malik, including the visionary speeches about the future. I specialize in the future, futurology, but that was Charles Malik that began this tradition from where I started to study. In 1983, he delivered a speech through which he said, I am wondering now, and we were in the 80s, nobody would even think of what is a 21st century. And he said in that speech in Arabic, I'm wondering what will be the fate of Middle East Christians after the year 2000. That speech is historic. And now we are discussing, among other minorities, of course, the fate of Christian minorities. The last time I sat with Professor Habib Malik on a panel, it was in Beirut. It was in 1987 when he invited me to the American University in Beirut to discuss, guess what, the fate of minorities in the Middle East. So these are ironic oddities that links us, all those working in that field, to come again in Washington and address it at ASMEA. Professor Robert Rabil, who teaches Middle Eastern Studies and leads Middle Eastern Studies at Florida Atlantic University, has actually replaced me. That is the university where I taught for many, many years, and bypassed all the work that I have done. He's an advisor to the Florida Society for Middle Eastern Studies. It is probably now the 3rd regional organization of Middle Eastern Studies after MESA and after ASMEA. We hope ASMEA will become the first in the future. Professor Rabil basically started as an expert on Iraqi issues. He worked in the archives of the Iraqi state, and then he moved to become an expert on Syrian politics. And then he is becoming now a leading scholar on the Islamist movement inside Lebanon. His career and publications are indicating that we're going to see more books and more articles. I have published with my colleague Robert, quite a bit. Last we have Professor Frank Salami, who actually also is following the path of becoming an expert in the field, not just of the minorities in general, but of the linguistic identity issues, which are the most complex and difficult, the self-perception of these ethnic minorities. He began as a specialist on what was known then as Lebanese nationalism, Lebanese Phoenicianism. And then he moved from that field of expertise to the pre-Arab, and one would even say post-Arab or marginal to Arab nationalism minorities. And he has published extensively in that direction. And I had done significant research interactions with him. So with this, I would like to say I am impressed for being assigned by the ASMEA leadership to be the discussant, the chair and the discussant of this great panel. So I would like to, first of all, invite the panelists to come one after the other, and then when we will finish, we will basically start the questions and the answers. Professor Bruce, please.
Thank you, Professor Faris, for your kind words. Thanks to the organizers of the conference. This has been a very stimulating day all around. And thanks especially to Frank Salamet for organizing this panel and for inviting me to participate in it. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Frank. Language, as we well know, has been a central, perhaps the central factor in the development of modern ethno-national identities and accompanying nationalist movements. This was especially the case for Arab nationalism. The Arabic language was heralded by generations of nationalist thinkers and activists as the nation's eternal glue. Its modernization, its standardization, and its dissemination was to be the language of the state. This was central to their political projects. Secular Arab nationalists in the Arab-speaking Eastern Ottoman lands and Egypt believed that Arabic could serve to transcend the confessional, tribal, geographical, and historical differences and to forge integrated nation states and a common regional order. For believing Arab Muslims, Arabic special status, of course, as having been the language in which Allah revealed his message to Muhammad, made it unassailable. Nationalist movements in North Africa largely shared the Arab nationalist doctrine being propagated in the East. Beginning in the 1930s, for example, the ideologues of Algeria's national movement proclaimed the Arabic language, along with Islam and territorial nationalism, to be the central pillars of its rejection of a century of French settler colonialism and the French project of incorporating Algeria into metropolitan France. Morocco's national elite held a similar Arab Islamic orientation, and upon achieving independence, North African states officially defined themselves as Arab. They joined the League of Arab States. They later formed the five-nation Arab Maghreb Union. Arabic was declared to be the sole official language of the state. Islam was declared the state religion, and the Arabization of education and public life was made a top priority. Educationally, they directed their history curriculums towards the East, linking their society's roots to the rise of Islam and its spread across North Africa beginning in the late 7th century. Ironically, both Algeria and Morocco had, in some ways, they literally had to become Arab after independence, and they did this, among other ways, they did this by importing thousands of teachers from the East, many of them members of the Muslim Brotherhood, to teach a standardized version of Arabic, which was designed to replace French as the language of education and administration. This Arabic, of course, differed sharply from the North African dialectical Arabic that was being used in daily life. Now, those teachers are long gone, but French remains an essential language for higher education and white-collar employment in North Africa. But language issues in North Africa are not just about being about French versus Arabic. There is also the Berber dimension. A substantial minority of Moroccans, between 35 and 40%, numbers differ, even some say more, some say less. Moroccans speak one of the three main dialects of Tamazight, the Berber language. In Algeria, the numbers are 20-25%. In Libya, 8 to 9%. In Tunisia, 1 to 5%. I don't know, my map seems to have disappeared. I have to click on the mouse? Yeah. There we go, good. And that's roughly, that should be useful. In other words, we're talking about in North Africa somewhere between 15 and 20 million persons. Now, modernization theorists and Arab nationalists had anticipated that Berber identity, that Berber language would and even should fade away as states became more coherent, integrated, modern. Indeed, the percentage of Berber speakers in Morocco has probably dropped by half since the French protectorate was installed nearly 100 years ago. But what those theorists and those Arab nationalists didn't anticipate was that Berberness would be durable, and that there was an ability to adapt to changing times. Paradoxically, it was the decline of the Berber language, spurred by state centralization and modernization and Arabization policies, which spurred the emergence of the modern Amazigh identity movement, which explicitly foregrounds the collective Amazigh Berber self while seeking to renegotiate the terms of the Berbers' accommodation with various others, the nation-state, Islam, and modernity. The central demands of this movement are recognition by state authorities of the existence of the Amazigh people as a collective and of the historical and cultural Amazighite of North Africa. And the most immediate and concrete manifestations of that recognition are to be the recognition of Tamazight as an official language equal to Arabic, and to redress the marginalization of Berbers over the last half century. Interestingly, the rise of the movement was part of a more general trend. Ironically, the ever-accelerating processes of globalization, which some thinkers herald as the harbinger of the long-awaited post-national age, are also, these processes of globalization are also generating an intensified politics of identity marked by ethno-cultural assertion by formerly marginalized minority groups, combined with the demand for democratization of political life. For some, e.g. the Kurds, this has reached a critical mass, morphing into full-fledged nationalism within territories, or separatism, depending on the place and time and individuals. Berbers are not in that position, and they may not ever be, but they too have achieved a measure of recognition and self-definition that was inconceivable a generation ago. So how did this all come about? After all, Berber-Arab differences throughout history have been socially enduring, but otherwise muted. Not since the initial Islamic conquests have there been significant episodes of interethnic violence in North Africa. However, the state-building and nation-building formulas of both Algeria and Morocco proved to be inadequate in addressing the specific Berber components of their societies in ways that would promote overall comity. This is true notwithstanding the fact that one finds Berbers among the elites of both countries, as well as in Islamist opposition movements, who are the bête noire of the Amazigh identity movement. In Algeria, the Berber movement's demands are more overtly political, the results of decades of tension, punctuated by bouts of civil revolt and confrontation between the regime and the territorial and cultural core of resurgent Berberism, Kabylie. Two of these eruptions took place in 1980. The mythical Berber Spring. Yes, there was a Berber Spring before there was an Arab Spring, and Berber activists make a big point of emphasizing that they were there first. And of course, there was in 2001 the more violent, what's known as Black Spring. And these are now central events on the Amazigh commemorative calendar, and not just among Kabyles. The Kabyle Berbers have played a leading role in fashioning and propagating the grand pan-Berber narrative in the Berber diaspora and in the international arena, while also privileging their Kabyle-ness. There's more to say about the relationships between the state and Berbers in Algeria. I won't have time to go into this in detail, but it should be mentioned here that the Kabyle-centered Berber culture movement played a vanguard role in challenging the hegemony of the Algerian authorities during the 1980s. And one cannot understand the sudden opening in the late 1980s of the Algerian state without knowing that the Kabyles were in the forefront of challenging the hegemony of the state at that time. During the 90s, during the terrible civil strife in Algeria, the Kabyle Berberists were also very active and putting demands forward, and, implementing lengthy school strikes, achieving a certain measure of recognition. Blood flowed in 2001 in the so-called Black Spring. Again, the outcome was one in which the state ended up dominating, maintaining order. This didn't lead to a revolution, but the Kabyles remain present, and the Kabyle demands are simmering. And there is one can certainly suggest that the issue remains open, and it seems that even in the past few months, with the ongoing protests in Algeria over a variety of issues, which one doesn't read about in the Western press because it hasn't reached the critical mass yet of a major challenge to the regime. Certainly, one can expect, I think, that Berber Kabyle activism will be part of the next phase of Algerian political life. Now, in Morocco, Berber-Arab differences have been less politicized, and the historical background is quite different. But culturally speaking, the Amazigh identity movement has now emerged onto the national stage. Berbers in Morocco have more demographic weight than Algeria, but they don't have a single focus, and this does impede efforts to promote a Berber movement there. There's also a different history in Morocco of Berber association with the state. Morocco's officer corps in the first decades were largely Berber, and together with rural Berber notables, they became partners in the palace's effort to achieve hegemony over other forces. Military coups, failed military coups in the 70s stigmatized the Berbers heavily and resulted in, contributed to brutal repression, both of those who had been involved in the coup and other political opponents. These were the bad years, the years of lead in Morocco. Overall, in fact, the intellectual and political proponents of Arabization in Morocco had little cause at the time to doubt that Berber identity was being channeled into very tame ways and being neutralized and even folklorized, and that this was the direction, that this was, kind of an inevitable process, indigenous peoples being marginalized and reduced to, as I say, to folklore status. But this is, as I said earlier, did not come about the way it had been predicted. By the early 1990s, as Morocco began to revive politically, the authorities discovered that there was an Amazigh current that needed to be addressed, and the gestures had to be made to it. And this, a big push in this direction came with the ascent of Mohammed VI in 1999. And here we see, as part of a concerted strategy to counterbalance a resurgent Islamist movement, and to always with the goal of maintaining palace hegemony over an increasingly liberalized political system, the king embraced the Amazigh movement, partially embraced it as an integral part of Moroccan nationhood. And we can now say that we can see that Amazigh activism has spread to campuses, to the media. There is now an Amazigh television channel. There are Amazigh associations, even in the rural areas, and the picture is very, very different than what it was 20 years ago. From the perspective of the Moroccan Amazigh current, the proverbial glass has appeared at times to be half full, other times it seems half empty. The two-pronged strategy of activism from below and linking itself to the palace from above has been somewhat problematic at times, but it also seems to create a useful division of labor, allowing the movement to essentially pocket the gains offered by the state while preventing the flame of the Amazigh cause from being extinguished by the authorities' strategy of co-option. Even so, the way forward is not clear. There was quite a bit of discouragement and disappointment a year ago when I spoke with people, and people didn't know where things were going. And it's not surprising then that Amazigh activists took an active part in the Moroccan version of the Arab Spring protest, something called the February 20th movement, a sort of amalgamation of different civil society groups, which included both secularists and Islamists. In the demonstrations in Morocco, we saw Amazigh flags flying in the streets as they marched for a more democratic Morocco. It wasn't to overthrow the regime, it was to reform the regime. In fact, the Amazigh movement received swift acknowledgement from King Mohammed VI as he made efforts beginning in March, to stay ahead of the curve, to be proactive, to forestall the kinds of tsunami events that took place in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere. And hence, as the Moroccan monarchy has done so often before, the lid was kept on the level of protest, and protests were managed in ways that certainly that the monarchy bought time. With regard to the Amazigh issue, the new Moroccan constitution, which was drawn up by a Blue Ribbon Commission and then ratified overwhelmingly in a constitutional referendum in July. This new constitution includes in it the recognition of Tamazight as an official national language, state language, which belongs to the heritage of all Moroccans. This is a historic breakthrough for the Amazigh movement, even though its implementation will be very, very difficult, and certainly it will be challenging for the movement to implement the constitutional recognition. I know of no other core Arab state, self-defined Arab state, which has more than one official language, and Morocco is unique in this regard. I'm running out of time, I know, so let me try to make a couple more points in the couple minutes left. The Amazigh movement does not aspire to dissolve regions' existing state frameworks, but they desire to foreground the place of Berbers within them. Nevertheless, there are more radical currents, individuals, activists within the movement that do speak about territorial issues. They do speak about autonomy. They do speak about federalism. They do speak about regional decentralization. We see this in the Kabyle region. We see it in the Rif in Morocco. The movement in general also follows the path of other beleaguered minority groups by seeking inclusion in the global discourse on human rights. The Catalans serve as the ultimate exemplar for the Amazigh movement, and the Catalonia government, regional government, provides funding for Amazigh activities. There's more to say, but I don't have time, really, only that I would argue that the process of reshaping and redefining the meaning of Moroccan and Algerian collective identities has already begun, and we even saw this Berber input into the politics of North Africa being expressed in a very meaningful way in the Libyan uprising, in which long forgotten, ignored Berber communities in Western Libya actually played a role in the military unfolding, the military events, the battle against Gaddafi forces. The ideal picture for the Amazigh movement is a politics which are more inclusive and more tolerant of diversity, allowing for Amazigh cultural and linguistic flourishing within a framework of genuine democracy and adherence to the rule of law and respect for human rights. Now, given the centrality of religious-based collective identities in the Middle East and North Africa, and the lack of experience with genuine Western-style democracy, the Amazigh movement's vision surely sounds overly rosy. And one can hardly speak of the Amazigh movement as a mass movement. Still, it has gained a measure of respect and recognition from the states in which the Amazigh communities live, and this legitimation has given them new confidence, I think, to press their demands. And in concluding, almost a century, take the historical perspective, almost a century of efforts by North African nationalist movements and newly independent states have failed to subsume Berber identity under state and Arab ethnic identity rubrics. While Al Jazeera appears to have created a virtual pan-Arab identity, this does not and cannot I think, replace the particular context and contours of individual states and societies. It seems now, as we're entering into a new, more contested era of contested politics, that the opportunities to pursue Amazigh identity politics are likely to increase. This may well give rise to more tension, but it also carries the potential for contributing to meaningful political liberalization, as well as ensuring a measure of dignity for the Amazigh people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Faris, for those kind words at the beginning. And I also want to thank ASMEA and the organizers for including me in this illustrious scholarly gathering today. Due to some logistical misunderstandings, there were some delays, and my full paper is not with you, but it will be following the conference, I hope. I'm going to say a few words about fears and apprehensions shared by native Christians in the Middle East today with respect to what we're now used to calling the Arab Spring. And then I'm going to try and perhaps point to the future, to what I think is a possible solution. And I guess I'll give away that solution by saying I'm a thorough federalist, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Many springs around the world in recent years have taken place. Two come to mind, the East European Spring with the fall of communism, and the South African Spring with the end of apartheid. But in neither of these two, nor in any of the other springs that one can also point to, have Christians as Christians felt endangered as they do in the current unfolding Arab Spring. Now, there's much tendentious skepticism out there with respect to the Arab Spring, from those who, for whatever reasons, want it to fail. I don't belong to this category. And my criticisms, my apprehensions, my warnings, my doubts stem from altogether different motives. In a sense, I try to bring to you the deep concerns that are very real of an indigenous community with all of its permutations, the Christians of the Middle East. Nothing would please me more than to see the fears and forebodings I will voice about the Arab Spring's impact on native Christians evaporate into thin air. And, if you like, a happily ever after or a Hollywood-style ending materialize for everyone. Failure, in the case of the Arab Spring, will not merely be because some of the repressive dictatorial regimes and the autocrats who run them end up surviving. That is failure, but for me the real failure is indeed a catastrophe, would be when what replaces the fallen despots turns out to be Salafism of the jihadi and takfiri variety. It is fine to be hopeful about prospects of democratic pluralism in liberated Arab societies, but we're seeing a string of Freudian slips of the Islamist variety, followed by swift and feverish reassurances that you shouldn't take any of these things seriously, everything's going to be fine for everyone. I mean, last night's Libyan ambassador sort of said this, and I'm sure he was sincere, but his boss back home, the head of the NTC, had, of course, declared that the Sharia would run post-Gaddafi Libya. Ghannouchi in Tunisia said more or less the same thing, and then they quickly backtracked to try and reassure everyone. I'm also finding it a bit irritating when I read, as I did a few days ago in Beirut's Daily Star, someone like Rami Khouri actually draw a comparison between Ghannouchi and Thomas Jefferson. This sort of unbridled, premature, and unwarranted euphoria, I think, is way out of line. Just read Ghannouchi's writings, Rami, for God's sake. Now, the next point I want to make is the slippery slope. And I think this is a very real prospect. It can happen despite the best of intentions, which evokes the familiar saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I'll give you an example, and we'll take the example from the Iranian context. If you ask almost anybody, who replaced the Shah of Iran? Most likely the answer would be Ayatollah Khomeini. Very few will say, well, you know, there was Qutbzada, there was Bani Sadr, there was Bakhtiar. These names are not known to anyone. They emerged. They were attempts to bring about a post-Shah liberal politics, and they mostly got their heads chopped off. That's the slippery slope. So Islamist light, in other words, versions of Mr. Erdogan, could easily slide towards Salafism and Takfirism. In Egypt, frankly, the differences between Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis are insignificant when it comes to the impact on the Copts. Again, if we see the slippery slope. Freedom is the most important ingredient when we talk about native Christians of the Middle East. In fact, historically speaking, there have been really two narratives for the Christians of the Middle East. The vast majority have what we have termed a dhimmi narrative, namely at some point or other in the last 1300 years, they have succumbed to domination by Islam, and they've had a series of restrictions placed upon them in order to be allowed to exist physically in their ancestral homes and practice their religion. A small minority headed or spearheaded by the Maronites of Lebanon and those Christians who threw their lot in with them have maintained a certain amount of free existence against tremendous odds and at a great price. Which brings me to something that we keep hearing from the Vatican, and that is that Christians have a very important role to play, a positive message, a mission for the region, and so on. And while that may be true, there's a philosophical fallacy here, and that is that you must first exist and be free before you can play any role. And so free existence precedes philosophically and is a necessary prerequisite for any positive contribution, role, mission, message toward the wider surroundings. In today's world, dhimmitude in all its forms, whether it is legal, in other words, on the law books in certain countries, whether it's psychological, which is very often what remains after the legal statutes have been abolished, or whether it's attitudinal. All of these are unacceptable in today's world. Now, Christians face a very difficult dilemma in the Middle East today. On the one hand, their values, their beliefs don't allow them to condone corruption and the atrocities of regimes, under which they at times were not as mistreated as they might have been. On the other hand, these same Christians are genuinely alarmed about what may replace these regimes, namely Islamism. And unfortunately, this dilemma puts them in a position of being accused falsely of being supporters of these nasty regimes. So it's not a happy picture. One example, to say, as U.S. Ambassador Ford to Syria recently said, and I like Ambassador Ford, and he had been until he left Damascus doing a very good job. To say, as he said, that Christian fears of Islamists are exaggerated actually deepens precisely those fears, coming from the representative of a country that really did not do much to stop the decimation of Iraq's Christians, and appears to be doing little with respect to Egypt's or Lebanon's Christians. Christian fears, my friends, are very real. They're not exaggerated. They are genuine, and they're not a smokescreen for supporting the regimes. And those harboring these fears are not delusional. Every community has horror stories to tell of empirical persecution and killings, and I won't go into examples because they're all over the news. Copts, Maronites, Chaldeans, Assyrians, Orthodox, Syriacs, Melkites, we can go on and on. All of them have experienced abuse and murderous attacks from both the Islamists and the dictatorial regimes. So to say, as some superficial Western analysts optimistically do, that in the Arab world today, among the youth, there's a counter-jihad underway. Laptops, not suicide bombers, Robin Wright, and so on. I think is, first of all, to superficialize the whole discussion, and secondly, none of this really allays the very deep existential fears that the communities I'm talking about have. The bottom line, in my opinion, is that there is eroding confidence. There is really no trust in the robustness and effectiveness of what is generally called Sunni moderation. Again, it's the slippery slope. Christians feel they are before failed promises of Sunni temperance. The ball is historically today in the court of Sunni moderates to save the Arab Spring from the slippery slope. The litmus paper test is the treatment of minorities. This, in fact, is the crux of what is today at stake in the Arab Spring. This is the historic responsibility and test for Sunni moderation, if it exists. If Islamists take over in North Africa, many people, with time, will seek to flee from those repressed societies and their new Islamist oppressors. This will mean more boat people, the phenomenon that Europeans are dreading, heading for Lampedusa as a first stop, and then other points north. And so there will be a direct adverse impact on Europe for allowing or for tolerating Islamist takeovers. Sunni moderates, so-called, for example, and this is another example, the followers of the late Hariri and what is known in Lebanon as the March 14 movement, none of them voiced a syllable of protest recently, in recent days, when in the Ain al-Helwi Palestinian camp near Sidon, about 150 new recruits to Al-Qaeda and to other Salafist Palestinian groups completed their training and graduated. All of this raises a very important issue which I will not deal with, and that is the anomalous nature of America's Sunni allies. Pakistan, now we know that there are revelations that on some level they're allied with the Taliban against the United States. Saudi Arabia, the toxic brew of Wahhabism exported worldwide. Egypt, veering towards militancy. Only Turkey so far looks good and has, I guess, the edge of being a NATO member, but that story is still it's unfinished business. Underlying, well, I should say also that the Middle East is not understood unless one pays attention to nuances. And there's a lot of counterintuitive appreciation of some of these nuances. Lebanon, for instance, is a very unique place. It's quiet when everywhere else is turbulent, and it's turbulent when everywhere else is quiet, as we see. One example of the layers of complexity: Hezbollah, which is obviously has engaged in acts of terror and abducted people, Westerners and others, and so on, is anti-Salafist. And so there's a certain edge to Hezbollah's arms and power that, in a sense, protects, quote unquote, the slide towards Salafism. Hezbollah is also against the wholesale naturalization of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, most of whom are Sunnis. And so again, in other words, there are nuances. And it's not black and white. It never is in the Middle East. Now, I'll take the remaining few minutes just to say a few words about the hopes. The region, as we all know, has two maps. There's an underlying ethno-religious, sectarian, tribal map. And then there's, of course, the visible Sykes-Picot vintage map with those interesting, although weird, straight lines running through the desert throughout the Levant. What we are seeing is a kind of reversion or devolution of the region or parts of the region back to its primordial aggregates. I think what happened in Sudan is very important. This is, I think, the first time in Islamic history where a certain territory that was under Islamic rule left through a referendum. I mean, East Timor probably comes close. So artificially imposed visible maps, especially coming from colonial powers with a unitary state in mind, namely France and Britain. We may be seeing now the turning of the page on that model. Let me just say that if my analysis is correct, then clearly the way to go would be federalism. And I'll say a few words in conclusion about federalism, but before I do that, let me just quickly say that there are, in my opinion, some false solutions. One of them is this idea that many have of parachuting secularism onto the Middle East. Secularism is something that took a long time to emerge in Europe. And the Middle East, if it's ever going to play with that concept, is going to take an even longer time. The idea of cultivated citizenship. Yes, but again, this doesn't happen overnight, and it requires a certain fairly sophisticated democratic context in which it could develop. Another false solution would be what I would call experimentation. This is easy to do from the safe distance of Washington. I hear lots of people here say, you know what, let the Salafists come to power. Since by definition they don't have answers to the challenges of modernity, they will come to power and they will fail and we'll be done with that. Fine, you can afford to experiment from a distance. I don't want to be part of that experiment because it's not going to end that smoothly. Okay guys, we're Salafists, we failed, so goodbye, we're leaving. The only solution is federalism. And as I said, I'm a federalist. It's the only political system tailored for mixed, divided, composite, and heterogeneous societies, which is exactly what we're dealing with in the Middle East. The Ottoman insight back in the 19th century and earlier of the millet system was a very interesting insight. Of course, the givens were different, but the insight is you work with the given rather than trying to change the given or homogenize. The Russians went for Russification in Central Asia. The Turks didn't do the same in the Middle East. They went for the millet system. So federalism is a malleable concept. It is tailored. It can be tailored to accommodate local givens. Two things federalism is not. Federalism is not a recipe for fragmentation or the creation of enclaves. It doesn't have to be that. This is one of the misconceptions. And federalism is not necessarily entailing geographic segregation. And I'll tell you why. Because the intellectual repertoire or arsenal of the federal concept is very rich. I'll just give two quick examples. The concept of the ombudsman, which comes from Scandinavia originally. But the idea is you can have a group within a larger group, and they would have an extra layer of protection in addition to the laws of the land, which would be the ombudsman. We can go into lots of details. The other one comes actually from Stalin's lexicon, the oblast idea. Now, you're going to tell me, come on, Lebanon is too small for all of these things. Nothing is too small for a well-tailored federalist proposal. And I think, I'm being told I have 2 minutes, so I have to choose what I want to say from what I have. Okay. So concepts like proportional representation, equal rights and respect of rights and freedoms, regardless of the vicissitudes of demography, all of these would be part of the federal package. Substance, not merely form, must be emphasized when we talk about democracy, especially when democracy is being applied to areas that have no experience of it. In the Islamic world, minorities have not been properly treated throughout history. I'm sorry, but the dhimmi system was romanticized by certain historians, mainly Western, during last century to mean a system of tolerance and a system of acceptance, and that's not the case. It was more like a system of gradual liquidation. So for an Islamic context, emphasizing majority rule might be playing into what Tocqueville calls the tyranny of the majority. Especially in that context, one should emphasize minority rights. And everyone is a minority in the Middle East except the Sunnis. But in a place like Lebanon, even the Sunnis are a minority. Everybody is a minority. Actually, the Sunni Mufti recently made that point. Of course, he made it because he wants to get some political mileage out of it. You always have to read that level in any statement in Lebanon. But I can tell you that even if demography develops so that one of the groups crosses the 50% mark, Lebanon is still going to be based on consensual politics for a very long time to come, because that's exactly the way you balance this can of worms and keep it from imploding. I have more to say. I think what I'm going to do is relieve the chair from my pressure and leave it at that. Maybe we can take up some of these things in questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to speak standing up. I think better, and I don't use notes. This is why I would like to stand up. Thank you, Dr. Faris, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. When I submitted the paper mainly dealing with Islamism and how Islamism engaged the political system in Lebanon, and especially what we call the Maronite regime, mainly the political power or the political prerogatives that the Maronite obtained since the independence of Lebanon. But then you had the Arab Spring, and the Arab Spring had significant impact on the region. But more so, it had a great impact on Lebanon and second Syria, where it had mixed results, and those mixed results were reflected in how the Christian community very much responded to that Arab Spring, where, as Dr. Faris and Dr. Habib mentioned, the March 14 had a certain take on it, but then the religious establishment of the Maronite Church had a separate take on the Arab Spring. Very much close to what Dr. Malik said. Yes, it reflected those fears, those really fears, native fears probably, of the Christian. But here, myself, as I stand and I look at the history of the Maronite, the Christian church, and what is happening, I see two processes. I see the process where the Islamist movement, whether they are the Jam'a al-Islamiyya, the Sunni movement, or Hezbollah as representing the Islamist Shia movement, this is one process that dealt with system and dealt with Christian Maronitism in a way that somehow undermined them. And then you had the Arab Spring that somehow the mixed result came in accelerating that impact on the Christian minority and in furthering the split in the Christian minority. And here, let me go back to the history and highlight a few points. The Christian church in Lebanon played an extremely important role in creating Greater Lebanon in 1920. And really the stamp of the Maronite church very much were strong on the political system. The political system on what was created was built on what is known the confessional system, where power is distributed along religious line. And the Christian, thanks to that system, obtained imtiyazat, or privileges, or you can call it prerogatives, more than the others. Then the 1950s came, and this I'm speaking about the Islamists. You have an Islamic movement that started to be active there, which came to be the Islamic Association, something that I examined in my book. My book is not outside for some reason, but this is recent, my book, where the Islamic Association, as led by Fathi Yakan, whom I consider the pioneer of Islamism in Lebanon, and he supported in the 1950s the Nasirites, or the pan-Arabists who were attacking him and attacking his movement, and not to stand by the Christian who very much went and supported the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957, and then you had the mini civil war. And it was mind-boggling to me why Mr. Fathi Yakan is going to go ahead and support those who are clamping down on him and not to side by the Maronite, what he called the Maronite regime. And then the 1960 came, and then the Islamic Association was approved as a party in 1964, if I am not mistaken. 1970, you have the war, 1970 war. What was the position of the Islamic Association regarding the system? What was the position of the Islamic Association regarding the other parties, including the pan-Arabist, the leftist, and of course, the different Christian parties? Well, let me tell you this. He sided immediately with the pan-Arab and the leftists. And more than that, they established a militia, the Mujahideen, that fought what he called the Maronite hegemony over the Lebanese state. So to him, as a matter of fact, it was more about removing this Christian prerogative or removing this Christian somehow free society in Lebanon, in contrast to other societies where Christian really suffers, including in Egypt. And why I mentioned that? I mentioned that because I discovered through my research in that in 1979, after the Syrian went into Lebanon in 1976, he published a book. And in that book, to my surprise, he went and he spoke about fusing, merging of Syria and Lebanon with the aim of undermining Maronite hegemony. And this made me ask the question, I don't understand, is he an Islamist or really a follower of Kamal Jumblat, who really led somehow a strong opposition to the Maronite? And what I really came to the understanding is that to him, removing Christian power was more important than his own ideology. Now, come in the 1980s. What happened in the 1980s? We witnessed now the emergence of Hezbollah. And the emergence and the policy of Hezbollah were early on reflected by the open letter that was delivered in the 1980s. The open letter stated bluntly, we are against the Maronite regime. We are for building an Islamic state. And not only that, we are for prosecuting and persecuting the Maronites associated with the Zionists. And you had a war, a really serious war between Hezbollah and the Maronites. Come 1990, we witnessed a new phase. Why? You had the end of the civil war, the last bastion of a Christian resistance were defeated. You have Syrian complete hegemony, not only partial now, but complete hegemony over the state. And now you have new elections in Lebanon. And here you have now a new definition of Islamism in Lebanon as to how to engage the system in Lebanon. Hezbollah came and he debated that locally. And the final say came from Imam Khamenei, where, according to him, ajaza wa wafaqa. Mainly, he agreed to go ahead and engage the system. The Islamic Association, still at the time led by Fathi Yakan, said, and this is exactly what he said, based on my research. Some of the book I didn't find in Lebanon, I found in Egypt. They got it to me from Egypt. He said that we have to engage the system. Why? We need to redeem and salvage, mainly help the Muslims. Because if we're going to leave it like this, how they are going to protect their really interest, political interest, cultural interest, social interest. So very much he was worried more than anything else about Christian influence in Lebanon. Then came the 1990s, and here you have somehow of two policies that converged. A policy that came from the Vatican and the policy that came to be known mainly as led by Hezbollah and then supported by the Islamic Association, called in Arabic al-infitah, or opening up. And it is also synonymous with Lebanonization. Now, according to the scholar of the field, probably many of them are not here, they said, well, this infitah, what is going to do? This infitah is going to probably and most likely turn Hezbollah into a conventional party. And sooner or later is going to integrate in the state. And the Islamic Association went along with that. But this infitah really became somehow a double standard policy. What's the double standard policy? On the one hand, yes, Hezbollah sent people to the Maronite Patriarch and they said, we want to have national dialogue, we are not against you. But on the other hand, Hezbollah went ahead and attacked anybody dealing with Israel, and even so attacked the Patriarch when a Maronite was killed he was with the South Lebanese army, and the statements that came out, on the one hand, they support. On the other hand, they really somehow they criticize and describe certain Maronite, and sometimes it is really generic, where they are traitors. So here you have a discourse that really somehow it has a strong double standard to it. And the Islamic Association was along with it. But then came the Vatican and John Paul II visit to Lebanon. And he issued there what came to be known as the papal guidance to Lebanon. Mainly, it boils down to two things. That really the Maronite community, the Christian community, should engage more with the dialogue with the Muslims, and to be really regarding themselves as part of the Arab society. Now, what this affected, it really had the unintended consequence where you don't go ahead and criticize the Shia community. And by not criticizing the Shia community now, how you can go and you want to criticize the weapons of Hezbollah? Why? Because Hezbollah by that time became really the strong force, or the strong political and military force within the Shia community. And this put the Maronite Church in a very perplexing, extremely difficult position. What is going to do? And more so, now you have engaging the system. Most of the Maronite prerogative, I would say, were undermined. And this process continued until the 2000. 2005, we saw extreme changes. Changes in 2005, the Cedar Revolution. And with the Cedar Revolution, mainly what's important things that happened in Lebanon is that the Syrian cover for Hezbollah disappeared. What I mean, mainly Hezbollah always in Lebanon, it monopolized the resistance. And it accrued political dividends from that resistance. Well, I am the one who is resisting and everybody doesn't. I am the only party that has weapons. All the others didn't. But then what happened after 2005? Hezbollah went and started to go into the system. Mainly now, somehow they wanted to control the system. And suddenly, you had the concept that became a discourse in Lebanon, and that concept became called creating or building the society of resistance. And let me here quote for you, word for word, what Naim Qasim, the Deputy Secretary General of Hezbollah, mentioned in an op-ed piece that was published in An-Nahar and in his book. And this is exactly what he said. He said, resistance for us is a societal vision in all its dimensions. It is cultural, it's political, it's social, and it's informational. Resistance for us is for the people and for the mujahideen, is for the ruler and for the ummah. And this is what he went along and he said further. He said, never a day we accepted the concept of a group of resistance. What we have been trying to do, and now we are supporting, is the building of the society of resistance. Because only with society of resistance, you have continuity. So what he's saying, and this is what I said, and I said in my book, I said, yes, they are going into that infitah, but that infitah is about a reverse integration of Lebanese society into the project of Islamism, mainly in the project of resistance. So what do you have now? You have the emergence of few nationalist discourse built on jihad against Israel, where this jihad becomes consecrated not only in the political discourse in Lebanon, but also in the society of Lebanon. And this is why you have certain policy in Lebanon, certain discourse in Lebanon. You can't say anything against Israel. You can't say anything against certain things. They become taboo. And never this happened before. Then, what you have the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring took a toll on Lebanon, and especially on the Christians in the Middle East, and I would say, yes, on the Islamists. 3 minutes. Okay. We'll do that. We'll wrap it up in 3 minutes.
This is the only note you will read today.
And it took a toll. As a matter of fact, it took a toll on Hezbollah. And Hezbollah really, this is the party that at one time became, at first, it was initially cautious how to respond to the revolution in Egypt. And then somehow, reluctantly, they supported it. They supported vocally the rebellion in Bahrain. But when it came to Syria, immediately they stopped. Immediately they stopped. But on the other hand, what about the Christians? The Christians somehow, it coincided this with the exchange or with the change of the reign of power in the religious establishment. A patriarch has gone and a new patriarch. And this new patriarch in September, Al-Ra'i gave a statement that was considered controversial. Some of his statement, one part of it is that he is not against the removal of Hezbollah's arms without a certain resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And second, he really kind of, in certain statement, he was extremely worried about the fate and fortunes of the Christians, not only in Lebanon, but also in Israel, but also in Syria, as what would happen to them if you have a change. And this really has been looked at somehow an indirect, implicit, whatever you want to call it, for the Syrian regime. And I feel myself that it is true. These fears are true. The Christian church, and this is why I explained the two processes, has been really, and the Christian minority, especially in Lebanon, has been facing certain challenges from within and from without. And also, Hezbollah has been shrewd enough, smart enough to go ahead and deal with the system in a way like no other party dealt with it. And it took a strong impact on the Christianity. And here, since I have my time is a little bit off, so why is this patriarch and what really I would like to see the Christian church doing in Lebanon? Really, the Christian church has no beautiful option and no utopian options. It doesn't. Really, from an evil option to another evil option. And really, I think at the end of the day, the Christian church has no place really but to support democracy and to support democratic principles in Lebanon and outside of Lebanon. And let me highlight this. Hezbollah, at certain points, yes, at one time he speaks about abolishing the sectarianism in Lebanon, but then he went and he introduced a new phenomenon, democracy by consensus. What is democracy by consensus? Meaning where the majority cannot rule a minority. Something different that contradicts 100% the concept of democracy. And this is where the patriarch, really the religious establishment, and the Lebanese, they have to really, stand out, I think, and say, listen, we want to have a national coexistence, but we cannot compromise on certain things. Even if those regime is going to stay, the Syrian regime, what's the guarantee that the Christian is going to be any better situation than the future? The future, I know, is bleak, but given the history of Lebanon and the history of Islamism in Lebanon, they are facing the same future. So it's better for them to take a stand. And I thank you.
Can I?
You want to go there or you're fine?
No, I'll do it from here. But I mean, how does one speak after Robert?
Scream.
I'm really honored to be sitting with these distinguished scholars on the same table, and I sort of feel a bit of a fraud. I feel inadequate doing this, but I'll try to do the best of this. And unlike Robert, I will use a lot of notes, so bear with me. What I would like to suggest today is that the Middle East's current upheavals offer the possibility of an historical political leap, not unlike what happened during the 17th century in Europe, and that is the Westphalian order, a new state order, if you will. Something Professor Malik alluded to, and that is the emergence or re-emergence of suppressed entities and marginalized histories and marginalized identities. The Middle East political history of the past 100 years has been one defined by Arab and Muslim sensibilities, defined by assumptions and conceptions of identity that deem all Middle Easterners Arab. Therefore, Arab world and Middle East have become synonymous, if you will, synonymous designation based on this conception of the Middle East as an Arab world. And this model very seldom has been questioned in the past 100 years, whether in fora like this, whether in the academy, in popular perceptions, discourse. When you say the Middle East, it's pretty much the Arab world. And it's perhaps not entirely unfair to hold on to such fashionable precepts. Large swaths of the Middle East are, after all, inhabited by peoples who define themselves as Arabs, who speak a language, in reality 36 mutually incomprehensible languages generically labeled Arabic, and who are largely in sympathy with the aspirations of the Arabic-speaking peoples. And that's a direct quote from the Arab League. That's their definition of what the Arab is: a person who is in sympathy with the aspirations of the Arab-speaking people. They don't tell us what those aspirations are. Yet this is a cliched and misleading depiction of the Middle East, which, its dominant Arab character notwithstanding, remains home to tens of millions of people who are not Arab, who do not define themselves as Arab, who speak languages other than or in addition to Arabic, and who are not particularly in sympathy with the aspirations of the Arabic-speaking people. Indeed, among an estimated 300 million people throughout the Middle East and North Africa, there are some 15 million Kurds, 15 million Copts, some say less, 8 million perhaps. There are tens of millions of Jews, Armenians, Sudanese, Maronites, Assyrians, and others still, and I have not yet mentioned the Maghreb's Berbers, whom Professor Mahdi Weizmann spoke about. So you have tens of millions of people who are gifted native Arabophones, but who maintain non-traditional and sometimes problematic relationships with Arabism, and who do not consider themselves to be Arab. What's more, those pre-Arab or non-Arab Middle Easterners, if you will, their rights have been systematically and frequently flouted, and their existence as legitimate and distinct national and linguistic communities have often been denigrated and negated. Take, for instance, one of the most innocuous advocates of Arabism, Lebanese Arab nationalist ideologue Omar Farouk. Writing in the second half of the 20th century, Farouk argued that it is irrelevant, and this is a direct quote, it is irrelevant that Iraqis deem themselves a hybrid of Arameans, Persians, Kurds, Turks, Indians, and others. They still are Arabs in spite of their racial diversity, even in spite of themselves, because the overriding factor in their identity formation is the Arabic language. Likewise, Farouk stressed the inhabitants of today's Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and elsewhere in Northern Africa, I don't know what he meant by elsewhere, but that's again a direct quote, may very well be a mix of Berbers, Black Africans, Spaniards, and Franks, but by dint of the Arab nation's realities, he doesn't tell us what those realities are, but by dint of those realities, they all remain Arabs, shorn from the same cloth as the Arabs of the Hijaz, Najd, and Yemen, end quote. Sati al-Husri, a Turkish-speaking Syrian writer and spiritual father of modern linguistic Arabism, lectured throughout the 1940s and 50s and 60s on how one is an Arab pretty much because he, Sati al-Husri, said so. End of story. And I'll give you one of the most anthologized quotes of Sati al-Husri in this regard. He argues, quote, Every person who speaks Arabic is an Arab. Every individual associated with an Arabic speaker or with an Arabic-speaking people is an Arab. If he doesn't recognize his Arabness, we must look for the reasons that have made him take the stand. But under no circumstances should we say, as long as he does not wish to be an Arab, and as long as he is disdainful of his Arabness, then he's not an Arab. He is an Arab regardless of his own wishes, whether ignorant, indifferent, recalcitrant, or disloyal. He is an Arab, but an Arab without consciousness or feelings, or perhaps even without a conscience, end quote. Now, Husri was sublimely aware of the fascist impulses of the Arab nationalism that he was advocating. In fact, he bragged about the fascistic tendencies of the Arabism that he yearned for. And he said, quote, "We can say that the system to which we should direct our hopes and aspirations is a fascist system." But if Husri, emitted this sort of soft fascist type of Arabism, his disciple, Michel Aflaq, the co-founder of the Ba'ath Party, was an advocate of soft fascism and soft porn to go with it. He promoted outright violence and called for the extermination of those users of the Arabic language who refused to conform to his prescribed compulsory Arab identity. And extermination is his word. He uses the Arabic word ibadah in his book Fi Sabil al-Ba'ath, For the Sake of the Ba'ath, in the 1959 edition. All editions that came after 1959, that particular chapter was reworked, and that word extermination, which he had used several times in the text, was removed. But I'll speak a little bit about the soft porn issue. And that's why I call it this, because he said that Arab nationalists must be ruthless with those members of the nation who have gone astray from Arabism. Quote, "They must be imbued with a hatred unto death toward any individual who embody an idea contrary to Arab nationalism. Arab nationalists must never dismiss opponents of Arabism as mere individuals. An idea that is opposed to ours does not emerge out of nothing. It is the incarnation of individuals who must be exterminated so that their idea might in turn be also exterminated. Indeed, the presence in our midst of a living opponent of the Arab national idea vivifies it and stirs the blood within us. Any action," this is where the soft porn comes, "any action that we might take against those who have rejected Arabism that does not arouse in us living emotions, that does not make us feel the orgasmic shudders of love, that does not spark in us quivers of hate, and does not send the blood coursing in our veins and make our pulse beat faster, is ultimately a sterile action," end quote. Now, the sexual phraseology here is not coincidental, and it's not ornamental. These are foundational tenets in Arab nationalism. He truly believed in it. Fortunately, the Middle East's intellectual history of the past 100 years has been heedful of the region's diversity, taken stock of the region's non-Arab and pre-Arab heritage, laboring to valorize historical memories, especially in the Levant region, historical memories of the area as a crossroads of varied cultures and languages and civilizations, Arabs and otherwise. And here's the news flash. In the Arab-defined Middle East, there are still people using languages other than Arabic, practicing religions other than Islam, and there are still people convinced that their ancestors and they themselves belong to a people different from the dominant Arabs. Today, as the Arab nationalist edifice is coming undone, and as the legitimacy of states defined by the Arab order is being shaken, what many still term the Arab Spring, suppressed non-Arab and pre-Arab identities are being restituted, and forgotten narratives are being dusted and reconsidered, and perhaps getting a new lease on life. But this is hardly, as I said, this is part of about 100 years tradition of history, of idea and cultural history in the Middle East. It's not a novel phenomenon, and it's been a truth that has been evident to many Middle Easterners, namely those minority peoples who saw themselves as not part of this general Arabic ethnos, if you will. But our tendency here in the West, our infatuation with neat labels such as the Arab world, tended to blunt that reality. Long before the creation of the Syrian Republic in 1936, the precursor of today's Syrian Arab Republic, and indeed long before the creation of any of the modern Arab-defined states in the Middle East today, Lebanese thinker Antoun Saadi, he died in 1949, he was the founder of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, advanced the unique conception of Syrian identity as an Aramaic crucible and synthesis of many cultures and civilizations and ethnic and linguistic communities. He saw it as a rich tapestry of Levantine peoples, Phoenicians, Canaanites, Hebrews, Assyrians, and others who could not be defined as Arabs, in his word, without oversimplifying. Saadi wrote, quote, "The Syrians must completely do away with the myth that they are Arabs and that their destiny is somehow linked to the destiny of the Arab peoples. We, the Syrians, are not Arabs. On the contrary, we are the fountainhead of Mediterranean culture and the custodians of the civilization of that sea, which we have transformed into a Syrian sea, whose roads were traversed by our ships and to whose distant shores we carried our culture, our inventions, and our discoveries." More recently, Syrian thinker Adonis, and the name should be telling, this is an adopted name, it's not his real name. He's the most eminent among those modern voices making the case for a composite Syrian identity, wrote that, quote, "The lands that conceived of and spread man's first alphabet, the lands that bequeathed and taught the principles of intellectual intercourse, the lands that created the alphabet, the lands that bore witness to processions of the world's loftiest civilizations, from Sumerians to Babylonians to Egyptians, Hebrews, Phoenicians, and Romans, these lands that spawned monotheism, humanism, and belief in a compassionate deity, I say that I am confident that such fertile and bountiful lands will no doubt shake off the torpor, intransigence, and immobilism of Arabism and will hurtle skyward toward modernity and progress." So there is a clear celebration here of humanism, cosmopolitanism, multiple identities, and an invitation to cast aside resentful chauvinism as espoused by Arab nationalism, some of whom I mentioned earlier. There's a movement very similar to this in Lebanon, very similar to the Syrian movement called Phoenicianism, known as Phoenicianism in the early 20th century, evolved into Lebanism in the 1950s, that also argued for a hybrid mosaic of identity, something that is not essentially Arab or essentially anything else. It's a mixture of peoples that had no hang-ups about Arabs, but did not readily accept the idea that one is an Arab, that the Lebanese are Arabs or the Syrians are Arabs. There is a counterpart to this in early 20th century Egypt, the pharaonic idea in Egypt, which is being revived today in the early 21st century by a fellow by the name Ali Salim, who is a very committed advocate of Egypt as the child of the Mediterranean, not a descendant of an Eastern sand maiden, as he called it, somebody from the child of the Mediterranean, not the child of the Red Sea, as he put it. In 1999, and I will conclude with this, long before the fitful rise and fall of the 2011 Arab Spring, former Arab nationalist and public intellectual and leftist Arab nationalist Hazem Sarrié published a scathing critique of what he considered outmoded Arab dogmas and delusions. The Swan Song of Arabism, his book, was a work of painful introspection in which he called for casting aside the jingles of Arab unity, he said, and discarding the assumptions of Arab identity. Sarrié urged his former comrades in arms, his friends, Arab nationalists, to bid farewell to the corpse of the Arab nation. Arabism, quote, "Arabism is dead, and Arab nationalists would do well bringing a healthy dose of realism to their world's changing realities. They need relinquish their phantasmagoric delusions about the Arab world and let go of their damning and outmoded nomenclatures of unity and uniformity in favor of liberal concepts such as associational and consociational identities." Another former nationalist, Arab nationalist, Adonis, before he became a Syrian nationalist, more recently wrote in an open letter to Syria's young dictator, he wrote that a culture that accepts and privileges Arab identity at the expense of others is a culture doomed to extinction. A nation consumed by a need for oneness in thought, opinions, language, and belief is a culture of tyranny, not singularity. It is a collectivity stunting personal and intellectual enlightenment. History beckons to the Arabs, he told the young Assad, to put an end to their culture of deceit, for the states of the Levant are much greater, much richer, and much grander than to be reduced to the slavery to the benefit of Arabism. And no amount of cruelty and violence emanating from Arab nationalists will change the reality that the Middle East is not the preserve of Arabs alone, end quote. I'm going to end with another quote, but this time from the poetry that Adonis wrote on this issue. And I think it sort of sums up the whole idea of this expansive, elastic identity and the idea of casting one's gaze away from the idea of Arab nationalism. He says, "Bring along your axes and follow me. Pack up your Allah like a dying sheikh. Open a pathway to the sun, away from minarets. Open a book to a child besides the books of musty pieties, and cast the dreamer's eye away from Medina and Kufa." The choice of words is very important here. Cast the dreamer's eye away from Medina and Kufa. Come along with me. I am not the only one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you gentlemen, for this wonderful panel. Let me dive immediately into the second section, which is going to be shorter in time. We'll borrow a few more minutes because we need to engage. But let me make one statement. One thing is to be the moderator and a discussant of a panel of graduate students, have their little papers. And another thing is to be trying to deal with 4 generators of ideas. And you cannot really stop them because they have so much to say. But really, thank you for trying to be as disciplined as possible. What I'm going to do, instead of trying to be the discussant, of so many ideas, I took notes. Each paper, each presentation gave me at least 5 to 7 points, but I won't be able to cover everything. What I would like to do is to ask each one of the presentators to, in a very limited amount of time, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, to answer one of those questions, and then we'll ask you to raise your questions. First, I would like to ask Professor Mahdi Weitzman about the various trends within the Berbers. We understood that the Berbers are a very diverse, very large, we saw the map, kind of population, but you mentioned that in Algeria you have the Kabyle you have the Berber Kabyle in the northeastern part of Algeria. What would be different between the Kabyle current demand and platform, which is political and cultural, and the rest of the Berbers, if you could prepare that? I'm going to ask all the questions once and for all. Professor Habib Malik, you know, there are many, many issues, of course, that you raise, and we will follow you later in your writings, but let me ask you this one critical question about federation and federalism, and you applied it beautifully on the discussion in Lebanese issues. First of all, do you see it as a possible solution for other than Lebanon as well? We're talking Iraq, we're talking, you know, probably Syria or other places. And what is in your mind the actual measurement of success of a federation? What is it? What are the conditions for a federation to be possible? Because you lived, and I lived through, and Robert did, the 15 years of debating the conflict of Lebanon, and it did not happen. So what would be the measurement? Professor Rabil, you described strategically how the Islamist Salafists, and you mentioned Fathi Yakan, you know, I had an exchange with Fathi Yakan in the 80s. I was publishing articles and he responded. On the one hand, they prefer to block, first of all, the so-called Maronite imtiyazat or privileges above everything else. And then in the 80s, Hezbollah did the same. Do you think and see that there was one benchmark that brought both forces to stop that first strategy and then move into engagement and infitah? And I am advancing the notion of this is the fall of East Beirut. 1990, something gigantic happened in Lebanon. The de facto autonomy of East Beirut collapsed. So there was no reason to continue with the confrontation, and they actually engage in the infitah. Does that have any weight in your mind? Professor Salami, again, a lot of points, but I would be interested in this one issue about Arab nationalism, and you're the expert on Arab nationalism. When would you feel that Arab nationalism would move from the stage, the 20th century stage, of non-accepting others, the stage of fascism, or the stage of almost national socialism in the 30s, or in Italy, Italian nationalism of the 30s, to a liberal national Arab nationalism, whereby there would be no problem for Arab nationalists to recognize Kurdish nationalism, Coptic nationalism, Berber nationalism, and remain attached to the Arab identity. I think those are the keys that I found, and I would like now, you know, beginning with the professor to engage in the question. You can stay where you are and just give us in a quick way.
Yeah, it will be quick because otherwise it'll be another whole lecture. I think that if one wants to talk about the Kabyle specifically, one should begin with the notion that among the Berber communities, it's the Kabyles who were in the vanguard of developing a particular ethno-cultural or ethno-national consciousness, and I think that one could say that they have the sharpest collective consciousness in the modern sense of being an ethno-national group. In general, I would say that secularism among the Kabyles exists to a greater extent than among the other Amazigh communities, less Arabized, perhaps. One sees even among activists, Berber activists in Morocco, are most of them are very, very skilled in the Arabic language, and I think the Kabyles are not. And the Kabyles, and that's part of the whole experience with France and all that. The Kabyles in general have both a specific agenda, foregrounding the Kabyle-ness, and people most of them dismiss the idea that autonomy is a real version, but in practice they identify with that. And they also have a general notion that Algeria, the fundamental principles of the Algerian state have to change. Very hostile to the state, whereas in Morocco the attitudes toward the state are more ambivalent because they work with the state.
Thank you. The authorities put pressure on me that we have to evacuate. I'm going to put pressure on the panel to make it into a slogan, into a nice sentence. Professor.
Yeah. Very quickly, applicability of federalism. Of course, it's applicable throughout the region because these primordial aggregates exist in all these countries. We see it happening in Iraq, as Barham Saleh told us today. Now, Sudan was separation, but I'm talking more about continuing a unified entity, but with very strong attention to the rights and specific identity markers of each community within a federal system, and that would be the measurement of success. In other words, if universal human rights standards are liberated from the tyranny of numbers, that and then enshrined in a constitution, that would be the measurement of success for me.
Key sentence. Thank you so much, Professor Rabiel.
Well, thank you. As a matter of fact, the process might have changed, but the objective is the same. Why the project has changed? On account of two main developments in the Middle East. Mainly, you have a new leadership in Iran, Khamenei instead of Khomeini, which I mentioned in my talk, Ajaza wa Wafaqa, where he agreed to Hezbollah become a political party. And second, also in the 1990, the complete control of Syria over Lebanon, which very much Hezbollah had to accommodate that. So this is what happened. And the third thing is that when I mentioned Fath Yakan, as a matter of fact, split from the Islamic Association, and in the mid-1990, he created a new organization, the Islamic Action Front, which really now is more, well, he passed away now, but his organization is more in tune with Hezbollah than with the Sunni establishment.
Very good. Thank you so much. Professor Salami?
I'm not sure I have an answer. I gave a few answers. When will we move from the fascist phase of Arabism to a more accepting kind of Arab nationalism? When the shapers of opinion, the Arab nationalists, people whom I mentioned who were heavily invested in Arab nationalism, like Hazem Saghi, for instance, who says, let us go to the wake of Arab nationalism and bid it farewell. It doesn't mean that he's denying his own Arabness. It means that he is, inviting others to celebrate their own distinctness. I think Kanan Makiya put it best in 2003, in the run-up to the war in Iraq. He was speaking about democracy, and he said that the only way we can have, and I mentioned Kanan Makiya because he was also a committed Arab nationalist. He cut his political teeth in the ranks of the PLO, and he's not a Palestinian. And the PLO is the symbol, if you will, par excellence of Arab nationalism. He said, the only way we can have democracy in Iraq is if Iraq becomes federal in this order, demilitarized, and non-Arab. It takes a lot for an Arab to say this. Iraq, to remain in its current configuration, to become a democracy, has to be federal, demilitarized, and non-Arab. And I think this is the answer.
Well, thank you very much. What I would like to say is I would like to apologize on behalf of ASMEA that for this panel we won't be able to take questions. However, we're going to ask everybody to evacuate and outside in the corridor ask all the questions you want. Thank you so much.